Welcome everyone on Zoom now as well to our Naidoc Week seminar. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their cultural and spiritual contributions to society. It is my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Patrick Nunn. He's a professor of geography at the University of the Sunshine Coast. And I looked up a few secrets about him on his personal website, so please do and go check it out. It's quite a fascinating career. He's a trained geographer and geologist, and he did his training in the UK. And was interested in sea level changes on landscape evolution. I think he was pretty much fed up with the weather in the UK and went to Fiji. What a wonderful choice to pursue his academic interest in Pacific geological histories and cultural worldviews. And at the University of the South Pacific, he also developed an interest in past and future climate changes and their impact, and especially in island worlds. This work, as far as I understand it, has seen him be very much involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And he's been involved with this for over 30 years now. And his work in that space has amongst other things, led to him being or sharing in the award of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. If this wasn't enough, Patrick then came to Australia to enrich our research environment here, and he's really working on continues his work on climate change and the impact on cultures. He's got many, many awards. I promise not to list them all. And with that, I will just hand over to Patrick. Welcome very much. We are very excited to have you here today. Thank you, Patrick.
Okay, well, look, thank you all very much. And I think before I start, I should acknowledge all the medical professionals in the room, and thank you very much for everything that you've done for the rest of the community over the last few months. What I want to talk about today is some of the work that I've been doing recently that does extend back quite a long way about Indigenous memories and what they might mean, particularly in terms of tackling the future. And I also have my own acknowledgement to country. Maybe I won't go through it again, but I think the fact that this presentation celebrates Indigenous knowledge and demonstrates its extraordinary longevity and showcases its contemporary relevance does actually make it really appropriate to present during Naidoc Week. And I'd like to thank the TRI and Anche and Ryan for the invitation. And of course, I'm grateful to the Indigenous peoples of Australia who created these original histories and acknowledge the fact that they connect us to country and inspire and empower us all in ways that I hope you will appreciate 40 minutes from now, perhaps more than you do at the moment. I want to start off, of course, in central Italy. These are the Apennine Mountains in central Italy in a place called the Arrernte. And this is a meteorite crater, an extraterrestrial body that crashed to Earth. And that happened in this area about 412 AD. It was an area that was renowned for its paganism and its drunken orgies. And one evening, a meteorite crashed to Earth with a resounding thump. The people converted to Christianity and have never looked back. A clear sign of something happening. And this was a story, even though the event took place about 1600 years ago, that was only written down for the first time about 140 years ago. So clearly a very long memory that eventually was written down. The second example I want to give you is from Nambukulevu volcano on the island of Kundavu in southern Fiji. Nambukulevu is an active volcano. It last erupted just over 2,000 years ago, about 2,200 years ago. And people all around this volcano in the coastal communities, even on Ono Island, which is 50 kilometers away, witnessed this eruption. And to this day, they tell stories about what it involved, stories passed on orally. And they think nothing of this. I was gobsmacked the first time I went there, and they were telling me these things. I said, do you know how old this story is? I said, it's over 2,000 years old. Yeah, so what? That was their reaction. And I have a PhD student working on this island and on these stories at the moment and looking at variations from community to community. And then we can move to the western United States, to Oregon. And this is the famous Crater Lake. It's actually a caldera, not a crater, that formed as a result of the eruption of Mount Mazama, as we call it today, about 7,600 years ago. And when the first Europeans went to this area, they encountered Klamath Indians, people who told them stories about the terminal collapse of this volcano, stories that must clearly have been passed on for well over 7,500 years. And then, of course, we come to Australia. And in the distance, we have Kangaroo Island, looking out across Backstairs Passage from the Fleurieu Peninsula. There are Indigenous stories that talk about a time when people were able to cross this passage without getting their feet wet. And today that passage is about 32, 35 meters deep, depending on where you measure it. And the last time the sea level was this low was almost 10,000 years ago, probably more than 10,000 years ago. So if we are to accept that these kinds of stories have their basis in fact, then we also have to accept that they have been passed on orally from one generation to the next, in this case for more than 10,000 years. So this really just summarizes the introduction. We do have good oral traditions from parts of Europe, from the Pacific Islands, from the few parts of North America, and certainly a lot from Australia. And I think this underscores the fact that Australian Indigenous peoples have occupied this continent for around 70,000 years, and their cultural continuity that they have exhibited is almost unprecedented compared to other parts of the world. So it's no surprise really that we have very deep and very rich oral traditions in Indigenous Australian cultures. So what I'm going to do today is talk about 5 things. First of all, what do we know about the histories that are contained in ancient stories of this kind? And then I'm going to talk about Indigenous Australian stories of natural disaster. And then I'm going to talk about how we measure the longevity of these memories and what that means. And then I'm going to talk about some research that I've been doing recently with some colleagues about what people 7,000 years and more ago thought about the rising sea level. And this might be of great interest to those of you who are interested in psychological trauma and stress and things like that, and the way it alters people's behavior. And the last thing I want to talk about is what lessons are there? Are there any lessons for today from looking at the distant past? So, first of all, original histories in ancient stories. What do we know? Well, most of us listening to this presentation, probably handicapped as I was by our upbringing. We are taught that some stories are grounded in culture, our culture and others' cultures. And we are taught that those kinds of stories are often entertainments or fables. They're not true. And we grew up in a world where fictional stories were a part of life. I have children, as I'm sure many of you do, and the bookshelves are filled with fictional stories. I mean, there's a few encyclopedias in there, but it's mostly fictional. And I would suggest that our modern love of fiction derives from what I've called here a deep-rooted human weakness for narrative that originated in stories that were told and carefully remembered by our pre-literate ancestors. And as we've seen, some of those stories have been remembered in diverse contexts for thousands of years. we're naturally skeptical. I mean, people like us in this room who can read and write, we're naturally skeptical of any suggestion that stories with often considerable detail could have been passed on orally for thousands of years. And Michele Rassese, he's passed on now, but he's here. And he was the person who really opened my eyes to the breadth and the depth of oral history. He couldn't read or write. He couldn't speak English. But my goodness, he could talk. This particular evening, he was up till about 2 o'clock in the morning, and everyone else was falling asleep. And he was telling us story after story about his ancestors and about the places they'd been and the incidents that had occurred. And it came home to me then that, we, as literate people, we tend to sideline people who are not literate and the knowledge that they hold. And I just wonder whether this might be what I've termed the arrogance of literacy. I mean, we can't help it. We can't help being literate. But does that sometimes blind us to the possibility of valuable knowledge and considerable knowledge that's held by people who are not literate? Might it be because we doubt our skepticism? Might it derive from the fact that we ourselves can't recall much information unprompted? After all, what can we remember today? How many phone numbers can we remember? I'm old enough to have grown up, maybe a couple of you are, with telephones that you actually had to dial, and you actually had to remember people's phone numbers, or at least write them down on a piece of paper. Now, of course, you just press a name. And I like to think that I could have remembered perhaps 15 or 20 phone numbers when I was in my teens. But how many birthdays can we remember without having to check somewhere? So I put it out there that perhaps we've become trapped by literacy. Maybe it's made us lazy. Maybe we've become so dependent on the written word that we've lost our capacity for remembering things independently. And it's becoming clear that our pre-literate ancestors did not merely remember vast quantities of knowledge, they also used art and music and things like poems and performance as memory aids. So today we look at these things and we think, oh, it's art, it's aesthetic, it's derived from a sense of what it means to be human. But I think all of these things derived from a pragmatic need to remember and to convey knowledge as accurately as possible. Because for our ancient ancestors, the most important thing was to pass on the knowledge they'd acquired to their children. It was about survival, especially in harsh environments like those of Australia. So just as our children today learn from books, in oral cultures, children learn from the so-called dreaming libraries stored in the elder's mind. I'm not terribly comfortable with the term dreaming libraries. I think it's a little bit pejorative. But anyway, that aside. So let me move on to the second part of what I want to talk about, which is some of the Indigenous Australian stories that I've been working on with some of my research students. People arrived in Australia around 70,000 years ago. We're never going to know exactly when, because the place they arrived is underwater, probably somewhere off Arnhem Land. But since that time, we've had volcanoes active in at least 2 parts of the country. And you might think, hey, volcanoes? Australia? No. But we do. The two groups, the two groups are, there's a group in far north Queensland, and there's a group in the southern part of South Australia and Victoria, as you can see there. Give you a couple of examples. Lake Eacham in northern Queensland is a maar volcano. That just means it was created when liquid rock rose up and encountered a body of cold groundwater, and there was an explosive eruption that created these characteristic circular forms. But it formed about just over 9,000 years ago, and there are Indigenous stories that recall this event. I don't know if I need to read all that, but you can see what I mean. The camping place began to change, the earth under the camp roaring like thunder, and so on and so on. The people tried to run from side to side, but were swallowed by a crack which opened in the ground. And then if you go to the Northern Territory, almost in the heart of Australia, you can find the Henbury Meteorite Craters that formed when meteorites, a shower of them, hit this area about 4,200 years ago. And there are indigenous stories that recall the formation of these meteorite craters. One story talks about how a fire, devil, came out of the sky and killed everyone in the vicinity 4,200 years ago. My particular focus has been on Indigenous Australian stories that talk about times when the ocean surface was much lower than it is today. And I consider that these stories are likely to recall a time after the end of the last great ice age when sea level rose 120 meters or so from about 120 meters below its present level to its present level. And around Australia, this process ended about 7,000 years ago. So sea level rose and reached its present level about 7,000 years ago. This is a graph that shows what I'm talking about. So on the left side of the graph, you go back about 150,000 years ago, the sea level was low. It rose up during the last interglacial and then gradually started falling down to the last ice age. The coldest time of the last ice age was around 20,000 years ago, when sea level was about 120 meters below what it is today. And humans arrived about halfway through the graph. They arrived about 70,000 years ago, at a time when the sea level was about 60 meters lower than it is today, and continuing its net fall. And then they lived through the rapid rise of sea level that I'll talk about in a minute after the end of the last ice age. Australia has shrunk by about 23% since the last ice age. So the light brown coloring that you can see on this slide shows where the shoreline was during the last ice age. There was actually a land bridge that connected Australia to New Guinea that's not shown here. But it was much larger than it is today. Sometimes thousands of kilometers, the shoreline was further out to sea, particularly off northern Australia. And obviously Tasmania was part of the Australian mainland at the time. And we have stories collected now from 21 places all the way around the Australian coast. Indigenous Australian stories that talk about a time when the sea level was lower, and stories that plausibly recall the rise of sea level after the end of the last ice age. The details of these stories are essentially the same. They recall times when land that's presently underwater was dry, where islands that are now offshore were once contiguous with the mainland, and how people walked across this land, naming its features that are now underwater. And then how the ocean rose over the land, flooding it gradually, the water never receding. And that last point is very important because these are not flood stories. These are not stories about water coming up, flooding the land and then receding again. These are stories of sea level rise, the water rising up slowly, flooding the edges of the continent and not receding. This is the sea level graph again, and this is the sea level rise that I'm talking about. You can see compared to the sea level fall which preceded it, it's very rapid indeed. Very rapid means in human terms, very disruptive, and therefore they're very memorable, and therefore a good topic for oral traditions. I'll just give you a few examples. The first example is from the Gulf of Carpentaria in northern Queensland. And these are the Wellesley Island group. You can see the mainland on the bottom left there, Mornington, Bentinck, and other islands. And there are Indigenous Lardil stories that talk about how in the beginning our home islands were not islands at all, but part of a peninsula running out from the mainland. And our people say that the channels were caused by Gangur, a seagull woman who dragged a big raft back and forth across the peninsula, severing the neck of the peninsula until they became islands and mainland. The second example is the slide I showed you earlier across Backstairs Passage between Kangaroo Island on the left of this map and the Fluria Peninsula in the top right. And there are many, many versions of this story. They involve a tall and powerful man called Ngurunduri who had two wives who fled from him. Some of the stories say that the wives were not really good. Some of the stories say the man wasn't very good. Obviously, I'm not taking sides in all this, but there is an element of blame and justification for what unfolds in every version of the story. His wives fled from Gurunduri along the south coast of the Fluria Peninsula. And when they got to Backstairs Passage, they were able to cross Backstairs Passage towards what is today Kangaroo Island through a combination of walking and wading. When Gurunduri got there, he saw what they were doing and he summoned the waves to rise up and drown them, and their bodies were washed south and became the islands you can see there called the Pages, since which time Backstairs Passage has been submerged. And like I say, there are many versions of this story. If there was just one version of this story, then you might say, well, it's an outlier, it's an anomaly, it doesn't actually mean anything. But the fact that we've got similar groups of stories saying the similar things from 21 places all the way around the coast of Australia really should give us pause, I feel, and make us think, well, maybe there's something in this. There are similar stories in Northwest Europe, and I'm collaborating with a number of French anthropologists and archaeologists to look at these. And I just really put up the map here to show you the red crosses there all represent places where there are stories, and the bigger the cross, more stories, where there are stories about lands that have been submerged and stories about how and why these lands were submerged are contained in Breton culture, as they are in Gaelic cultures in Wales and Cornwall as well. So let me now move to the third part of my talk, measuring the longevity of memories. How do we measure how old these memories are, and what are the implications of this? Well, geologists routinely use radiometric techniques to determine the age of particular events in the past. And these are some of the ages that we've got for the volcano stories that of the kind that I talked about earlier. Where these events are recorded in Indigenous stories, and all of these do have Indigenous stories associated with them, both in Australia and elsewhere, these dates give us minimum ages for the creation of these stories. So you can see, for example, that some of the Mount Gambier, Mount Shank in South Australia, Victoria, these are coming in at around 4,000, 5,000, maybe as much as 6,000 years ago. I have a PhD student who's working on Kinrara in northern Queensland, and we've got dates there that seem to go back more than about 9,000 years, and so on and so on. So we can put ages on volcanic events quite convincingly. But the stories about sea level rise, it's not quite so easy to put precise ages on these. What this graph on the right here shows is how sea level has changed in the last 13,000 years or so around the coast of Australia. We are not able to be more precise. We're not able to be so precise that we give a line. So we give an envelope which is shaded in blue. And we know that sea level at different places around Australia was somewhere within this envelope at certain times. So if you look at the line, the broken line on the bottom, this shows when sea level was 60 meters lower than it is today. And you can date that to a time somewhere between 13,100 and 12,300 years ago. So by interrogating the Indigenous stories about coastal inundation around Australia, we can reconstruct coastlines and we can put minimum ages on those stories. So, for example, the ages of the stories from the Wellesleys fall somewhere in the red box at the top, somewhere between 7,450 and 9,340 years ago, would have been the most recent time at which the sea level was low enough for these stories to be true. In other words, for Mornington and Bentinck Island to have been connected to the mainland. Kangaroo Island, like I said earlier, the story is probably more than 10,000 years old. And similar stories from northwest France could be around the same time using the same method. So what are the implications of all this? Well, The implication, the principal one, is that it can be demonstrated that in pre-literate societies, memories, knowledge was able to be transmitted across generations for thousands of years. Not just transmitted, but transmitted in intelligible form for thousands of years by people like Michele Rassese. And I think that this forces a reevaluation of the power and the capacity of oral recall, and should lead us to ask, well, how much knowledge and how much understanding may have been lost as a result of our comparatively rapid transition to literacy. Homo sapiens has been around for just under 200,000 years. We became literate. Most people became literate only within the last 100 years or so, although there was obviously some literacy before that. Language is, this is a quote from Walter Ong, who wrote a book called Orality and Literacy a few decades ago. And he wrote that language is overwhelmingly oral. Many of the languages spoken, only about 106 have ever committed to writing in a degree sufficient to produce literature. And if we look today at the 3,000 languages that are spoken across the world, only some 78 have a literature. And I think that this kind of figure really brings it home to us, what we must have lost, inevitably, what we must have lost in our rush to literacy, and what it is probably too late to retrieve. And again, I'm not being judgmental here. I don't think that anyone would have done things differently with this kind of knowledge. Literacy is obviously far more attractive to human development than a continuation of orality. So maybe I'll reflect on that more as I get towards the end of the talk, but I want to now just talk a little bit about what people 7,000 years and more ago thought and did about the rising sea level. And it might seem incredible to you, as it was to me when I first stumbled on this, that there are indigenous stories, particularly from Australia, but also to some degree from Europe and from India, that actually talk about what people thought about the rising sea level after the last ice age, and actually what they did about it. So what was the situation for Australians living near the coast 7,000 years ago? Sea level had been rising for about 8,000 years, submerging around 23% of the land area of Australia. That's a lot to live with. That's potentially a cumulative anxiety that is quite profound and enduring, and I suggest could even have had some impact on the development of the human psyche. In certain places around Australia, the rate of shoreline retreat every year may have been several kilometers. And can you imagine that? Can you imagine what people in Brisbane would do if the shoreline was moving inland or trying to move inland, several kilometers every year? People like me living on the coast of the Sunshine Coast, I mean, we'd be up in Mullaney, wouldn't we? I mean, as soon as we possibly could. Clearly a source of stress, and clearly a worthy subject for including in stories. So how can we know what people 7,000 years ago were thinking? Well, there is direct information. And I'm going to give you two examples from Australia, one from northeast Queensland and one from the Nullarbor Plains of the south coast of Australia in WA. And we can infer from these stories and others how people living along the coast appear to have behaved. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. It won't take too long, from Australia and from France. So what did Australians 7,000 years ago think about the rising sea level? Well, in northeast Queensland, there's an Indigenous story collected at the Yarrabah Mission in the 1890s that talks about a man named Gunya who climbed a mountain with his people to escape the rising sea level. And when he got up to the top, he lit a bonfire and heated rocks, and then he rolled these rocks down the slope into the ocean. And that, it said, succeeded in checking the flood, stopping the rise of sea level. Sorry, I'll just have a glass of water. A drink of water. And there's a similar story from Cape York that talks about how people were throwing hot stones in the sea to stop it coming up any further. So this is clearly a response, and the fact that it's an efficacious response suggests that it is about 7,000 years ago, in fact, when sea level did stop rising around Australia. Along the Nullarbor coast, we've got another story that talks about Indigenous people rushing to the water's edge at the base of the cliffs and bundling thousands of wooden spears together to stop the encroaching water. And they managed to contain the water. So they succeeded in stopping the rise of sea level, the encroachment of the ocean on the land. Again, that suggests that the story probably comes from about 7,000 years ago when the rise of sea level did in fact stop. But it also suggests rushing to the water's edge, that there was a degree of urgency about this. And it talks explicitly about building a sea defense in the same way that people today build sea defenses. Whether it's a concrete sea wall or whether it's a palisade of stakes, with vegetation behind it. There are many similar attempts being made today to stop the rising sea level. And there's another story from the Nullarbor that talks about how it was feared that the sea flood would spread across the whole country. Okay, that must have been a source of huge anxiety for people living there on the coast, thinking, well, when is this rise of the ocean going to stop? Are our children and their children ever going to be able to live in this land that we live in today? Or will the whole country go underwater eventually? And it talks about how a barrier was created that's said to have restrained the oncoming waters. This is Bob Brown's picture of the Nullarbor. So these stories include elements of displacement and despair, anxiety and direct action, all very similar to the range of our responses today. So we can infer that Australians 7,000 years ago not just developed practical responses, but also spiritual ones. And there's been some research done on this. There's stone arrangements in places like Mine Island. There's stone arrangements along the northern coast of Queensland and elsewhere around the Australian coast that many archaeologists who are very attuned to this kind of thing believe may have been spiritual responses to rising sea level. And you might think, well, why? Because most Indigenous people today and in the past do have a spectrum of responses to sources of external stress that range from the practical to the spiritual. And I'm sure that's quite clear to most of you. Going back to Brittany in northwest France, if you've never been there and if you ever get the chance to go, I do recommend you take a day to visit the stone lines at Carnac. These are lines of standing stones, parallel lines of standing stones that extend for kilometers across the landscape, even under the ocean. And for a long, long time, well, to be honest, nobody still knows exactly what they are, but they're big and they have been erected purposefully, obviously at huge effort over probably hundreds of years. And they have recently been interpreted as, and I'm using the French term here, well, the English translation of the French term, as a cognitive barrier. And the way it's been explained to me was that people were so anxious in this part of Brittany about rising sea level 6,500 years ago that they created these stone lines, which they believed would be able to support some kind of mesh, that would stop interference between the metaphysical and the physical world. And it certainly seems to me to be the most plausible explanation. They're not astronomically aligned, they're not burial stones or anything like that. So Again, I think we are starting to learn that in other parts of the world, besides Australia, that there were also similar spiritual responses to sea level rise in the past. What do French people think about rising sea level in the past? Well, there are many stories, and that's why I had the map up, because I'm just going to talk about the city of Is, Y-S, in the Baie de Douarnenez, on the western coast of Brittany. Is is said to have been a city that was protected, like many of these cities in Northwest Europe, by elaborate sea defenses, sea walls and floodgates and things like that. And I would suggest that what we know of the fragments of information we have about these, they suggest a long history of resisting sea level rise. This is the city of Is in this painting here in the distance. And the story goes that King Gradlian, who ran the show up there, had a daughter, and his daughter was either possessed by a demon or otherwise persuaded to open the floodgates one night when the tide was high, and the city went underwater. And so the city had to be abandoned. And luckily this saint was there and was able to drown Dahut to punish her for having caused the city of Is to be inundated. The point here, of course, is that we put human explanations on things that we don't understand. But all of these cities in Northwest Europe were eventually submerged. And that's a really important thing to differentiate, especially for people working in this area with rising sea level. After the end of the last ice age, the sea level around Australia stopped rising about 7,000 years ago and has pretty much sort of flatlined since then. In Northwest Europe, the sea level has continued to rise since the end of the last ice age. It's slowed down a bit, but the rise of sea level there has been continuous, which is why I think we have so many stories about submerged cities off the coast of Northwest Europe compared to elsewhere in the world. So what can we learn from all this? I think, and I'm planning to write something about this soon, but I think that we have underestimated the anxiety associated with sea level rise, prolonged sea level rise on coastal dwellers in every part of the world. And that anxiety is paralleled by the anxiety that many of us feel today, not just about the rise of sea level, but also about the rising temperatures and changing climate, which are driving the rising sea level. So the question I pose here is, are there lessons that we can learn from our ancestors' experiences with rising sea level that can help us navigate, negotiate our current and future encounters? And this is the last part of what I want to talk about today. The first lesson, I think, is that locally driven adaptation is best. Climate change, as everyone knows, is a global transboundary issue. And therefore, addressing its causes, which is mitigation, requires a collaborative response. Of course it does, because if we don't all work together to stop the causes of climate change, then it's going to get worse. But responding to the impacts of climate change, adaptation, is not always suited to generic global responses. Because it tends to sideline local context and local knowledge, which really, I would suggest, are key for optimal solutions. So the point here is that when we're thinking about how to mitigate climate change, the causes of climate change, it's great to sit in New York and Geneva and to sort of come up with strategies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and for planting more trees and so on and so on. That's great, and it's a suitable topic for a global initiative. But adaptation, people sitting in Geneva shouldn't be telling people in rural communities in Fiji, like this one, what they need to do to adapt, because local context is everything. And you might think, well, that's obvious. But it is also something that we can learn from the past, because what Australians did 7,000 years ago was to design and implement their own adaptation strategies. And science is only belatedly realizing that this kind of local autonomous adaptation is that which is most likely to succeed and be sustained. The literature in climate change journals in 2020 is all over this topic. It's all suddenly saying, hey, we must adapt locally, we must listen to local people, we must foreground local knowledge, traditional knowledge and understandings and things like that. We must stop getting on a plane and barging into communities in the Pacific and saying, do this, do this, do this, because this is what we do at home in Australia. So listening to local people, so the tide is turning, but it's also a lesson that we could have learned from the past. Direct action. Those who have vested interests in denying climate change might well be considered as vacillating. And there's an ex-president, oh no, he's still president, I think, of the United States. And he, of course, is convinced that it was the Chinese who created the global warming to punish the US. This kind of vacillation we see in lots of instances, and I encounter it at various levels as a climate scientist working in Australia. And I just wonder if we can detect similar self-interest, delaying responses 7,000 years ago. So was the rush of Indigenous people to the sea to build their palisades of spears along the Nullarbor shore an example of people power? Did people power win through in this instant, creating that barrier that restrained the oncoming waters? And, will today's people power succeed in a similar way? We're looking perhaps at a parallel here, which is almost all I have to say. The theme of the 2020 Naidoc week is always was and always will be. And under that theme, I would suggest that what our ancestors' stories can teach us very clearly is that we have the capacity as a species, as a part of an ecosystem, to overcome environmental adversity. But we have to adapt. We cannot continue to delude ourselves that things can go on as they always have. But I think our ancestors' stories hold a profound message of hope for our collective future. So the stories that I've discussed in this presentation all come from published sources, and those are the sources that I believe are the correct ones. I have a book that came out a couple of years ago called The Edge of Memory. I thoroughly recommend it, of course, but don't go and buy it. Just pick it up from the library and see if you enjoy it. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was just mind-blowing and so different to what we normally look at in the science space for us. So wonderful to see your kind of work aligning with ancient stories and very present, pressing issues. So the way we're going to try and do this, and I appreciate your while you bear with us while we juggle technology, is to take perhaps questions from the room first. And if you want to ask questions, please ask them really loudly so that Patrick can hear it. And Patrick, if you wouldn't mind repeating those. And while we're addressing a couple of questions here, we'll then look at questions online. So please feel free to post them in the chat and we'll pick them up in a second. So I'll open the floor here for a few questions. Anyone wants to start? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the amazing my question about the comparison between Brittany and Australia. So Brittany had already cities, so they called the cities implementation. So there was kind of a linear migration away from the inundated city to another place. In contrast, in Australia, people were more nomadic and still are. So is there anything known about migration behavior? So I guess it was more like a circular migration before already, because obviously every tribe stayed in their own country, but it was moving around. So how do the stories that you are talking about naturally migration behavior?
That's a really interesting question. The question is around when the sea level was rising, what kind of migration behavior did that elicit from the affected people? The short answer, unfortunately, is I don't think we really have enough information to be able to answer that really well. Some people have suggested that one reason why Indigenous Australians were nomadic at the time of European contact, or appeared to be nomadic, was because of displacement, was because of thousands and thousands of years of not being able to stay in the same place. Well, eventually you get to a point where you throw up your hands and you think, well, why should I try and stay in the same place? Why don't I wander the country? I suspect that's only part of the story. I don't necessarily think that. But it's really interesting when you look at the map today of Indigenous Australian lands and the different groups and the boundaries of their lands. If you look along the coastline, all the lands are ellipsoid like that, whereas inland they're all like that. And it seems to me that the ones along the coast have all been affected by rising sea level. So they've become squashed and lineated like that as a result of that. And you also asked about migration behavior in Europe as a result. I would suspect that, in Europe, yes, people moved inland, they were forced inland, but Europe is a much more crowded place and a much more ethnically diverse place. And I don't think it's simple enough just to sort of say, well, people moved inland and were incorporated into what was there because there were other groups moving in. That said, there's a really interesting book the name of which I can't remember, about the North Atlantic. And it says that, 400 or 500 years ago, although there were countries in Europe, the people of the coast were like a different nation, and they straddled political boundaries. And the people of the interior hardly ever went to the coast. Coastal people were like a sort of group all by themselves. They had a shared identity which had very little in common with inland people. So again, that could be some kind of an artifact of migration.
Yes.
The sea level plateau during Australia about 7,000 years ago, but you said that in Europe it continued to rise. Why did it plateau in one place and still continue to rise?
Yes. So the question is, why did sea level stop rising around Australia about 7,000 years ago? And why did it continue rising in Europe up until the present day? And it's a really good question. After the last ice age had ended, temperatures started rising, and all the ice that was on the land, on the continents, particularly in North America and Asia, started to melt. And that melted ice went into the ocean and caused the ocean level to rise. All the ice had effectively melted by about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. So in most parts of the world, the sea level stopped rising because there was no more water from melted ice coming into the ocean. But what happened in Europe was, imagine that this is Europe. And you get an ice sheet put on there like that. What happens is that the crust underneath the ice sheet bows down like that and actually pushes up bulges on either side like that. And when the ice melts, so the bit in the middle goes up again and slowly the bits on the sides go down. And Brittany and Wales and Cornwall just happen to be the bits on the side. So they are what geophysicists call a peripheral bulge, a crustal bulge that was created from the weight of the last ice, from the weight of the ice sheet that was nearby. And after the ice all melted, then that bulge started to go down. So sea level is rising. All the ice is melted, it stops rising, but the land is still going down, so the sea level continues to rise. And it's rising there at a much faster rate today than the global average because that process is continuing.
I might just ask one question from the chat. Yes, I can read. So one question was around, or Tommy Yaring's question was around transmission of the stories of rising sea levels from coastal regions into more central regions, particularly in Australia. How was the communication? Was there oral communication and relay of that information, and how might that have affected inland communities?
Okay, so the question is about how were stories about rising sea level communicated beyond particular regions? My sense is, I don't know the answer, but my sense is that they were not communicated widely. And the reason for this is that at 21 places all the way around the coast of Australia, we have distinct groups of stories that don't actually show any overlap. They don't actually show that they might have been informed by each other. And that's really interesting. And that suggests to me that those stories were created and held locally rather than disseminated widely.
And perhaps just one more question. Just what are your reflections, with the realization that most of the stories and ancient stories are transmitted orally, yet we are, at this rapid loss of languages and dialects within Australia and other places of the world. So how much are we losing, at what rate, and what is it going to do, and what are we missing out on?
I think it's very easy to be sad about the knowledge that we're losing, but I don't think we can seriously do much about it. I think culture changes, and sometimes culture changes very dramatically. And I think, unfortunately, we are condemned to, losing something like 7/8 of the knowledge that our ancestors once had, simply because it hasn't been written down, it hasn't been conserved. And I was talking to an elderly gentleman, not the one I showed, an elderly gentleman in Fiji in January last year. And I was saying, are you passing on your knowledge? Are you passing on your stories to the younger generation? He said, no, they're not interested. And he did this with his hand. This is what they do, They're all connected now to a digital world. They're all connected to a world that's far more exciting than the world that could be conveyed through sitting down and listening to their grandfather's stories. So he was very sad about that, because he said, look, my parents told me these stories and their parents told them, and so on and so on and so on. But it's all changing and it's all dying out. And I don't think there's very much that we can do. I'm sure that we are losing valuable knowledge, every hour, every day, every week. But there's not much that we can do about it. When the knowledge holders die, largely they take that knowledge with them. We can try and sort of push back the tide in a few places, but yeah. So I think there's it's concerning, but it's not something that anyone here can do anything about, I think.